Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So I want to begin today by doing something that I will tie in with the rest of my video, but I simply want to thank everybody who has either backed or supported or promoted my graphic novel. My graphic novel is now available on Indiegogo. It will be there for another, I think, 25 days, if I remember correctly, and the link is in the description if you wish to go over and see my attempt at trying to take all of these good story elements that I'm talking about and put them into my own story. But I want to thank everybody because we did hit a milestone overnight. We have hit our first stretch goal, which is $15,000. The book will now be fully colored. I'm thinking that the next stretch goal will be to increase the page count from 72 pages to 80 pages, because I always wanted to put that on the front of my book, an 80-page giant, just like those old GI Combat. And I would love to thank everybody by name, but I certainly don't have the time to do that. And I'm sure most of you would say, my thanks should be me making the book as best as possible, and I will certainly endeavor to do that. But there are three individuals by name that I want to call out. The first would be Michael Bancroft over at Late Night with Comicsgate. He has helped me immensely in so many ways getting this book out there. The other would be Tristan over at Nerdette's Newscast, who I know has been promoting my book on her live streams. And the third person, funny enough, would be Ethan Van Sciver. And I say funny enough because I've never actually had any direct contact with Ethan Van Sciver, but the number of eyeballs that he has dragged over to my campaign has been immense. This man is a beast at selling comics. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to call out those people particularly, because they are three very different individuals, and yet they are helping promote this new indie comic renaissance, which is really what I think the future of comics looks like. And that ties into the rest of my topic. What I'm going to talk about today is the death of progressive culture, quote unquote, progressive culture, woke culture, SJW culture, whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to look at the death of that through the comic industry. And I'll probably use a thumbnail of WandaVision for my video, because I think that show in particular is showing where this death of the comic industry is actually going to come from. But I'll get into that later. But the point is that I think that woke culture is dying. Now, I want to begin by saying that if you're listening to me right now, or you listen to other Comicsgate people, if you're subscribed and listen on a regular basis to Ethan Van Sciver, or Richard Meyer over at Comics Matter, or some of the medium to smaller channels, like Clint over at Sweetcast, like Doug Ernst, like Tristan over at Nerdette's Newscast, like Comics by Perch, or even myself. If you listen to any of us on a regular or semi-regular basis and know what's going on in the comic industry, I would say that you are ahead of the curve in understanding what is going on in our culture today with these quote-unquote progressive people and what they are trying to push. How far ahead are you? I would say you're 2 years ahead of even the people who just follow politics and understand this politically. I would say you're probably 4 years ahead of the normal person who tries to understand what is going on with this progressive culture, if you can call it that is infesting our society. Now, how is it that you came upon this knowledge? Well, you came upon this knowledge because what we do here is look at the comic industry. And I included those other people specifically, although there are a bunch more, because it's not comics specifically only that they're looking at, but the comic industry as well. And that's key. Because, as I have always said on my channel, the reason why I'm looking at the comic industry, or at the very least one of the reasons why I'm looking at the comic industry so intently, is because it is a good microcosm to understand what is going on a larger scale. It is a very self-contained industry, and it is an industry where we understand very much where this progressivism came from, how it infested this industry, and I would say the people who did the heavy lifting on informing us about that would probably be Doug Ernst and Bleeding Fool, although I did my part by putting together a couple of videos that talked about where this all came from and how it was tied into the political and how these people have no intention of stopping whatsoever. I'll take those two videos, by the way, and I'll put them in the description if you want to go back and listen to them. But the point is that we have very good information about where this this progressivism came from, and up until recently, we also had very good numbers and very good ways of seeing where the comic industry was at present, and we have a lot of people shooting off their mouths in the comic industry because they love to do that, so that they could tell us where they thought the comic industry would be in the future. So again, it is a very self-contained industry. We are able to see this progressivism in the past, in the present, and what they see it to be in the future. And we can take all of that pattern and, as I do, look at it as a whole, look at the big picture and understand very well what is going on, how this has infested this industry and where it seeks to go. Now, the thing about progressivism is that it is not creative in any way. They always follow the same pattern because they really can't create anything new. So, if we understand this microcosm of comics, we can take the pattern for that industry and apply it to larger industries, and that pattern will still hold. Larger industries that we don't know that much about, because they're either secretive or they're just too big, or any number of reasons. Industries like the book industry, like the television industry, like the movie industry. We can take this same pattern from the comic industry and apply it to them and understand exactly what is going on there. And I would even say that we can take this pattern and apply it to society itself and see what is going on, understand better what this pattern is that is going on with this progressivism that has infested our society and is trying to use it for its own ends. Now, to give you some evidence that you yourself probably understand better what is going on than even the politically informed conservative, I'm going to take statements from two individuals, both of them conservatives, both of them made in the last week. And these two individuals are people who are fairly good at understanding what is going on, taking it seriously, and planning for what it's going to develop into in the future. These two individuals are, number one, Anthony Torba, who is the creator and CEO of Gab, and the other person would be Glenn Beck, who is a conservative talk radio host. Now, as I said, these two individuals are fairly good at looking into the future and seeing what is going on. Anthony Torba saved Gab when they took down Parler because Anthony Torba looked into the future a couple of months ago, a little more, and said, I can see what's coming in the future. I'm going to prepare for it. I'm going to make sure that I am free from this tech monopoly or tech monopolies, and we're not going to be dependent upon them. Glenn Beck is one of those people who takes out a chalkboard and he looks at what has happened in the past. He looks at what these progressives are saying they're going to do in the future. He takes them seriously. He sees if it has happened in the past and then projects from the line of what is going on now into the future to see what is going on. Now, both of these individuals, as I say, are fairly good at getting things right at what is going to happen in the future. And yet, in this last week, Glenn Beck came out with a video where he talked about Disney being evil, and it just came as a revelation to him. Now, I have to say, the people in the comments were pretty much of my mind. The people in the comments were saying, yeah, where you been for the last 10 years, Glenn? But I think the more telling one was the statement from Anthony Torba, because he puts out letters, usually about one a week. What he talked about in the last letter was, to answer the question, where do we go from here? Where do people who are conservative, where do people who are populist go from here? And I would say he's right. It is a populist movement. It is from the people. It is a grassroots movement, what we see going on around us today. So he said, we need to stop looking at the person in charge to be the one to take the brunt of everything. We don't have Donald Trump anymore, and we shouldn't have depended upon him so much to begin with. And further to that, we already know that at the top levels, at the levels of government, big government anyways, and the big corporations, it's all a fixed game. And we know this quite literally now. You had that article coming out in Time magazine just last month where they just come out and admit, in their words, they admit that there was a conspiracy, a cabal of big tech giants, owners, politicians, and companies that were working in the shadows to secure democracy to get the correct outcome within the last US election. These are all their words. And they're saying it because when they do it again, they're going to say, well, we told you we were going to do this. We told you this is what we do, because they're going to do it again. So we know, 100% know, the game is fixed. At the top levels, the game is fixed. So what do we do? Well, Anthony Torba said, what we got to do is we need to create our own systems. We need to create our own economic system. We need to create our own social media system. We need to create our own systems of government, in so much as we need to go back to the basics and we need to look at the local governments, and you need to understand and try to get good conservatives elected in the posts of mayor or sheriff, or if you have a local judge that you can elect, and on school boards, or if at all possible, get away from the school board, because these schools are just trying to indoctrinate your children into this progressive ideology. But his gist was, we need to create our own systems. And again, I was listening to both of these men, and the only thing that was running through my mind was the line from Bruce Willis. "Welcome to the party, pal. How do the two of you, who are good at preparing for the future and seeing what is going to happen in the future, how are you only at this stage now?" So the point being that I know there are different methods where different people who are at the grassroots level understand better what is going on. But one of those methods which we use to understand what is going on, we specifically, is the comic industry. We've seen this happen in the comic industry, and we've been preparing, doing all of those things for at least 2 years now. I would say this is mostly to the credit of Richard Meyer over at Comics Matter, who about 2 years ago, probably more, started Let's Build a Spaceship, where he said, we already know what's going on. They're not going to change. We know they're going to drive the comic industry into the ground. So what we need to do is create our own systems. What we need to do, in his analogy, was we need to flee away from this spaceship of the comic industry. We need to grab whatever good things that we can take with us. We need to get into a life raft, and we need to jettison ourselves away from this thing before it destroys itself. And that's what we did 2 years ago. Now, he hit the ground running. I myself was a little slow on getting going, and I'm sure most of us are, but we've been doing this for at least 2 years now. So we've done all of these things that Anthony Torba is talking about for at least 2 years, because we're 2 years ahead of the curve. We know what's going on because we're using this small system that we're looking at, and we know exactly what is going on. So again, the point being that let's take this system of the comic industry and apply it to the larger system of society in general. So let's look at the comic industry right now. If we look at what we understand, and understand about 2 years ahead of what everybody else understands, if we look at where the comic industry is right now, and say this is where society is going to be in 2 years, I'd say we have a pretty good chance of understanding where everything is going. And this is something that I've done from the beginning of my channel. I used to go over the Twitter feeds for Marvel because Marvel is the industry leader and it uses Twitter to actually promote things more than its own website. Now that has changed slightly over the last couple of years, but it still holds. So when I first looked at Marvel's Twitter site over 2 years ago, this was a site where they were supposed to be promoting Marvel Comics, but only really 20% of what they were promoting was Marvel Comics. A lot of it was a whole lot of nonsense adjacent somehow, even in tiny ways, to Marvel Comics, because they knew they weren't going to change what they were making for comics. They knew they weren't going to make a good product, so they were trying to sell their product through other means. And those other means included things like cooking shows, things like shows about fashion, about cosplay, these shorts on the internet that are animated, a whole bunch of these nonsensical little things. They also had a menagerie of podcasts where they just shout out what exactly they want to do with the future of Marvel Comics, which wasn't good. And on top of all of that, they also promoted the video games, the television, and the movies. Now that was about 2 years ago. When you skip forward 8 months and I did my second video on the same thing, and you looked at Marvel's Twitter site, you saw that most of those small things were gone. All of those things like the cooking shows, they were pretty much just completely gone. The fashion shows, they were gone, although they still employed a fashion columnist at Marvel Comics. The things like the cosplay were very much downplayed, and all of these smaller things like the shorts on the internet, they moved over to the Disney Channel. However, they still kept the gaming, the television, and the movies, which was really bizarre because there is an actual site, Twitter site, for the movies themselves. So why they would promote them again on the other site, which is supposed to be not about the movies, was actually showing how desperate they were. But you could see that they were beginning to grasp at straws and taking only the things that would actually help them out because they couldn't spend any more time on these other things. They knew they weren't working. Now, if we skip forward from that, to about a year ago from when I'm making this video right now. And I specifically go to that date because although I didn't do a video about this at that time, this is the time when everybody decided that we were going to all be locked in our houses, to take a page out of the penal system instead of the medical system, and not just quarantine people who are sick, but to take everybody and lock them in their house. And things started to fall apart. Now, I specifically picked that date because I had to change significantly my own channel because of what was going on at Marvel, because Marvel began to fall apart in different ways. How do I know this? It's because there were things that I used to criticize Marvel, podcasts and the like, which just completely disappeared. So, to give you an example, the podcast that I most notably would tear to shreds would be the Women of Marvel podcast, which was run by Sana Amanat, who is the second in command at Marvel Comics. I would say the person in operational control of Marvel Comics. Or should I say, was the person. I do believe she's gone now, and I'll get into that in a minute. But this podcast, it just stopped. Now, they do take hiatuses every once in a while for a month, maybe two, but they've been going for about 10 years now, and they were chugging along pretty good. They made sure they got out new material almost 8 to 10 months of the year. But for the last year, they put out just a handful of these podcasts. And of these handful of podcasts, Sana Amanat has disappeared. And it's not just this podcast, others as well. You can see that they're starting to abandon these things because they just can't use them anymore. They know there's something that they can't afford to do anymore. Now, they still make them every once in a while, I think 1 or 2 every 6 months, but then all they do is rebroadcast them month after month after month. So for all intents and purposes, these things are dead or dying. Now, the thing about Sana Amanat being gone is that people like her, and I would also say Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes Captain America, these are people who, if they can go to greener pastures, they're going there now. Why? Because they see the writing on the wall. They see that things are starting to fall apart. And so they're moving on as quickly as they can, if they can, because they know things are going to fall apart really quickly, really soon. Also, with the other people who can't go to greener pastures, people like Mariko Tamaki, who is still writing for DC Comics, you can see a significant change in the way that they operate. Now, Mariko Tamaki is a very bizarre individual. I did an entire video about her, and I will link that into the description to show you just exactly how bizarre she is. And at that time, I said she was probably the best comic writer who would never write a good comic. Now, I might have to eat my words because some people are saying to me that she's actually starting to write good comics. Why? Well, because in that video itself where I covered her own statements, she stated that what she saw people as being made up of was nothing but a mimic. People are mimics. They're made up of nothing else. And she said nothing else. You just mimic what you see around you. So what is she doing right now? Well, again, I would say she and others like her see the writing on the wall. They know that if they want to keep food on their plate, they need to start mimicking something else than what they've been doing for the last couple of years. So you have all of this. You have these podcasts and all of these statements put out by Marvel and DC and the other comic producers. They're just starting to disappear slowly. You have these people who can move on to greener pastures already moving on or starting to move on to greener pastures because I would say they know exactly what is going on. They know that they're parasites in one form or another, and they need to go to someplace else which has money that they can use. The other people who can't go anyplace, they're starting to shape up in some fashion because they like to keep their bellies full. Now, at the same time, if you look at Marvel's Twitter site today, what do you see? Almost all of those things that I talked about that Marvel tried to use, Marvel Comics tried to use to push their agenda in order to push their comics, they're almost all gone. All you see there now, besides a little bit about comics here and there, is a concentration on the television. And I would say, on top of that, the movies are gone as well. If you look at the movie industry right now, I don't think anybody would argue with the fact that the movie industry is gone. At the very least, if it's ever going to come back, it won't come back for another 10 years. It's not coming back. So they can't depend on that anymore either. So what are they depending on? Well, it is the television shows. And that is a problem in itself. And why is it a problem? Well, because most of the A material has already been taken up by all of the movies. If you look right now at what they're pushing on the Marvel Twitter site, it is for television shows of Wanda and Vision, What If, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Kamala Khan, Shang-Chi, Black Knight. They're trying to ride the coattails of the Mandalorian and also still trying to ride on the high brought to them by the Black Panther. But here's the thing. All of that I have just listed, all of these are second, third, fourth tier characters and stories. Nobody knows who Shang-Chi is. Nobody knows who the Black Knight is. Some people do know who Falcon and Winter Soldier are, but those stories come from awful, completely awful stories. These are characters that I like, but these are characters that do not have the richness of history that they can convert into these large stories that they can put on a screen. The same with What If. I always loved the What If comics because I would read the title and go, oh, I want to read that. And then I would always be disappointed by what I got when I actually read the thing. It is always a disappointment. Also, if you look at Loki, that was never a stable character without Thor. And if you look at Kamala Khan, that's just woke ideology 101. Now, I know some people, again, like Richard over at Comics Matter, are saying that when it began, Kamala Khan as a book actually started out pretty good. And I would say, no, it didn't. This entire thing, and I've covered this in videos, the entire concept of Kamala Khan was Stephen Wacker, a self-declared male feminist who, by the way, after he self-declared in that, I'm thinking, well, I wonder what's going to come out about his past in the future. He went to Sana Amanat and said, we need to make a character based off of you for all of the little Kamala Khans out there. And this story, from its inception, was nothing but woke ideology. It was nothing but identity politics from its inception. And even if you look at the thing which is actually doing well right now, which is Wanda and Vision, these are stories that are second-tier stories. They're all, if I can see correctly, they're all coming from that very first John Byrne West Coast Avengers run in the comics. And I really liked those comics, but even when I read them, I knew they were second-tier stories. And so these are the stories right now which they're trying to promote in the beginning of this show. Now, I would say, to its credit, it's not actually taking the Batwoman approach, but it's using the older model. It's going to take a couple of seasons and bring in all of those people who are going to watch, and then the woke ideology is just going to be stuck right there in your face, slowly at first, but more and more. This has happened in sci-fi fiction for I don't know how many years now. In everything from Buffy the Vampire Slayer to The Walking Dead. This is what they do. And so these second-tier stories, which were still good stories from Wanda and Vision, that's all that they got. And I would say they're going to move into the two twins of Wanda and Vision pretty heavily within the next couple of years, and that's where your woke ideology is going to come from. And that's even if they last that long. Because again, let's look at the good characters who couldn't even keep their shows going. Characters like Daredevil. If something like Daredevil, a top-tier character, can't keep itself going for more than a couple of seasons, what the heck do you think that these low-tier characters are going to do? None of this is going to end well. And you add onto all of that the fact that even before the whole Gina Carrero thing, the numbers for Disney Plus were actually going down significantly, and now you got people canceling it left, right, and center. You can see that this is not going to go well for Marvel. Certainly Disney might actually be able to weather this storm, but the same cannot be said for Marvel Comics. And so we're looking at an industry right now which is on its last legs. And the whole point of all that I've just described is that it will not be able to live through this. Why? Because progressivism is a parasite. It is nothing more than a parasite. It can never create anything new on its own. And this is baked into the very notions that make up this ideology. It's all based upon critical theory. Critical theory was built on Marxist ideology in order to help promote the Marxist revolution, and they would do so by destroying institutions. And they would destroy these institutions of Western civilization by chipping away little by little at their base with constant criticism. Therefore, there is no such thing as positive, constructive criticism within critical theory. The basis of the entire ideology is to criticize constantly and relentlessly, to destroy. It is to destroy the foundations of Western civilization so that when they fall, the revolution can take place, but it is to destroy. It has nothing creative in its nature whatsoever. Therefore, it is always a parasite. It is a parasite that is attached to a larger system, and that larger system for progressivism itself is our culture. And so the pattern that emerges from Marvel Comics is that Progressives can create nothing new. They take something over and they use what is there until they drive it into the ground. And after they've driven the little thing that they've ridden into the ground, they try to jump ship onto something bigger. It is like a rat that is constantly moving from sinking ship to sinking ship. And so the death of progressivism is inevitable. They will eventually drive everything into the ground. But the point is that if we wish to save our culture, what we need to do on our side is create. And not only create, but create systems which are rat-free. And while that may sound like a tall order, it actually isn't, because we don't have to create these things from scratch. All we have to do is look at our own history and reinstitute the things that we know have worked. We need to reinstitute within our minds logic and reason. We need to reinstitute within our storytelling poetry and beauty. And we need to reinstitute in our own lives heroism and virtue. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, the link for my graphic novel is in the description if you wish to go and check it out. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.